So I do have a document open here in Fresco. Um, like I said, not a basics course, but just a quick overview of the lay of the land so that you're familiar with what Fresco actually is. It is an illustration app. It does have some great motion and animation features, and it is a very brush-heavy app. So for those of you who do a lot of drawing and painting, if you use apps like Procreate or Photoshop or whatever, this is a great place to hang out. It is a free app. So you can download this for Windows devices and also for iPad. I'm on iPad today. iPad always gets the iOS, the iPad app always gets the features first. We have a separate team building for Windows, so Windows is usually a few months behind with any of the features that we have. That's just the way it works, because for Windows we have to serve a lot more, obviously, devices and different operating systems. So, but yeah, it's a free app, and there's multiple plans as well for paid versions of it, depending on what you want. If you want all the brushes that I make, the 2,000 and some odd brushes, if you want 5 gigs of extra cloud storage, and let's see, all of your libraries and vector shapes and things like that, it's $9.99 a year. So pretty cheap. All right, let's move on. So I'm working on the free version today. Not going to probably do anything that isn't in the free version. So the free version has all the tools, it has a bunch of brushes, and it has all the features. There you go. All right, let's get moving. So first and foremost, with Fresco animation, we separate things out in a way so that you are not going to have a cluttered vertical layer stack. So first thing I want to point out is that if I were to draw any element here, okay, so I'll just draw a little circle here on the screen, just using the default pencil. In the bottom right corner, if you follow this little blue dot, by the way, you'll see where my mouse is at all times, or my stylus rather, okay? Down here in the bottom right corner, you'll see a little motion icon. And this will pull up your motion timeline. Now, it's important to note that this timeline is actually for this specific layer. And this is how I'm talking about as separating out what is normally a very cluttered vertical layer stack. This is going to make things a little easier because now everything's going to run horizontal for my timeline, and I can create multiple layers of animation. Another thing to point out is we have no layer limits that we put on you in the app. So that means that if you want to make a document with 100 layers, that's all animated, depending on the size of your iPad and how much storage and capacity it has and all that, you can. We're not going to stop you from doing that. The only thing that'll stop you is if your iPad catches fire, but we do not actually put any limitations around that. Okay, so you manage your own performance, you manage the document, and I think that's great. So I've had Fresco documents with over 100 layers where I'm just doing all kinds of things, and I just can open them in Photoshop right away. Another important thing to point out, I'll just jump out to the home screen here for a moment. If you look here, I have recent documents, okay? But if I go to my files, Fresco files are Photoshop files. They're cloud PSDs. So all of these files, okay, are my Photoshop and Fresco files just blended together. And I can open any one of them in Fresco, work on it, and then it automatically shows up in Photoshop. I work on it. So that seamless interop is great if you're somebody who has to kind of bounce around working on a mobile environment and working in a desktop environment, or if you need to share files with friends and things like that and you're working on a team. This makes things really easy. You'll see a blend of my own drawings in here as well as my son, who loves to pick up Fresco and draw on it sometimes. All right, so back to that document. I've got this little circle. I've got the animation or motion windows down here at the bottom. I've got my timeline here, okay? And then I've got a bunch of options down here. Let's just look at settings really quickly. As with any animation app, you want to be able to set your frames per second. So you can do that right here, okay? We have different playback options. So of course we have loop, which everyone is familiar with. It gets to the last frame, kicks you back to the first frame, starts the animation all over again. Boomerang is going to take you from the first frame to the last frame and then backtrack, okay, in reverse to the first frame and back and forth, hence boomerang. Play once, of course, will, well, play once, okay, and then it will stop. So for now, I'm just going to leave it on loop. Onion skinning is not on by default, but that will be changed in a future version of Fresco, either in May or June, I believe, because animators and other people using it have said, please just have onion skin on by default. We don't want to have to turn it on. So we listen, and we're going to do that. So I'll turn that on for you now. With onion skinning, you can control how many frames you wish to be able to see in front and back of your current frame, all the way up to 10 frames. Okay, so I'll leave it at about 3 here, and then you can change the opacity of the onion skin for whatever you like. We'll talk about document timeline later. All right.
I have
So those are my
sorry.
settings. Yeah.
I have a quick question, a generic one. So Kathleen is asking, can you open a Fresco file in Photoshop to continue working on the animation you have started in Fresco? I haven't been able to figure out how to do that.
No, I would not recommend doing that. And the reason is because, as you know, Photoshop does not use the same timeline that we do. So if you open a document that has animation in Fresco in Photoshop, your animation is safe and secure. Nothing's going to happen to it. Okay. But if you do choose to edit those frames or those layers, rather, okay, then you will get a notification in Photoshop telling you that you're about to modify this and this could change the way things appear in Fresco, and it will. So my advice to you is don't do that. And also, just so people understand something, we are actually working right now with the Photoshop team to figure out a way that if I start an animation in Fresco, it will, when I open it in Photoshop, give me the option to convert to a, a, a format supported by Photoshop so that my frames make sense and my animation makes sense. Okay. So Photoshop has video timeline, it has frame by frame timeline, but it doesn't work the same way as ours. And then we have the motion path issue. So the conversion from a motion path into frame by frame is the most likely scenario we're going to have as a way for people to be able to work with animation that comes from Fresco into Photoshop. And so, yes, that is something we're working on. But at this exact moment, if you want that animation to be preserved, you can open the file, but I wouldn't say, but don't mess with those layers. Okay?
Don't do that.
Don't do that unless you're ready to do something else with the file, like do some finishing touches with color adjustments and work on other layers or whatever you want. That's fine. Okay? Alrighty, so back to it. Let's go ahead and do a simple animation. All right. I'm going to simply add a frame, and you'll notice here with my little timeline, I can simply tap on this plus sign, and this is going to add a frame. And now what I've seen, okay, if I move in the timeline, you'll see the opacity of that circle, if I zoom in, will drop down to 40%, which is what I had set it for my onion skinning. So what's currently on this layer, okay, is nothing, all right, rather this frame. So I can go ahead and I can do this, okay, add another frame, and just keep on doing this, and then make it smaller until it's gone. All right, and then we can simply play all. Right here, we've got this little option to play our animation. You can take a look at it, and there it is. Now, look over here. This is one layer. So again, I'm not having to see a layer with a group or with a bunch of layers underneath it that are all of my frames. My frames are simply going to display right here when I need them. I can see them. If I move over to this layer, okay, which is a static layer with no animation, I don't see my timeline because for this layer, there is no animation currently. Okay, this is just a little sketch I was working on earlier. We'll mess with that later. But let's go back to this. And then once I do, okay, when I go back to the circle, I go back, I can see my animation. All right, now bouncing over to settings, of course, I can accelerate to 20 frames per second, and it's going to be much faster, as you would expect. We can change our mode to boomerang, go back and forth, okay, or play just once. All right, now let's drop that back down to 10. You can also long tap, and you can always set a value in any of the settings for a Fresco tool. That includes brush size, smoothing, whatever you want. You can long tap on that little window and punch it in with a number pad. All right, so let's do this now. Make a new layer, okay? So I make a new layer right here. There's a little plus sign. That's just gonna automatically add a layer. Very important to point out that Fresco allows you to work with pixel brushes, which I'm using now, okay? And that's what you're familiar with from any raster app, any pixel-based app for drawing and painting, but also for vector. And vector brushes and animation are also supported in Fresco. So I've just created a new layer, okay? This layer type is not yet defined. If I start to draw with the pencil, it automatically says, okay, I understand this is a pixel layer. And in doing so, it gives it a little icon right here on the layer that shows pixels, okay? If I undo that stroke, there's nothing left, a 2-finger tap to undo, you'll notice now that this layer, okay, has no layer type to it, right? It's just an empty box. So if I come over here on the left, all right, and I select my vector brushes, all right, you can open those up and just select a basic round brush right here, make that a bit smaller. And if I then draw a triangle right here, as I zoom in, you're going to notice that the circle is made of pixels. The triangle is infinitely scalable and always clean at 12,800% zoom. That is vector art. Now with that vector art, I still have a timeline down here on a separate layer. So I can hit plus, add a frame, and I can continue to animate with vectors. Now as I click forward, every time I tap to add a new frame, you'll notice that the circle, it's showing me what's happening with that animation as well. So I'm always able to keep track of all the animation happening on all of the separate layers with each of their own individual timelines. All right, so coming back here, we'll just turn this into a similar sort of situation where it just goes away into nothing. And now we have a raster animation and a vector animation in the same file. And this is not going to have any impact on how you export it. You can export this as, again, PNG sequence. You can export this as a MP4, or you can export it as an animated GIF. All right, and I can work with these vector and raster layers simultaneously without any issues. So that right there is already a point of distinction to note. Okay.
Knowing that vectors are always a better quality, because you can enlarge and do whatever you want. What's the advantage to do this in pixel mode? Animate in pixel mode.
Yeah, so with pixel brushes, of course, you're always going to have the option to have more painterly effects and different kinds of brush work that does not have that very hyper clean, sharp look. Vector art, as you know, has these edges to it that no matter what you do are going to be very, very sharp. Now, if you're working in an app like Illustrator, you do have options for gradients in vectors. But with an app like Fresco or most other drawing apps that are vector-based, you are drawing with clean-edged shapes. You're not going to have something like, for example, if I were to make yet a third layer, using pixel brushes that are even more interesting than the average pixel brush, we have a third category of brushes in Fresco called live brushes. These are pixel-based. They're not infinitely scalable, just like a regular Photoshop brush. So if I go, for example, into my Photoshop brushes or my pixel brushes in Fresco and go to the painting category, okay, there are these brushes called wet brush. All right, so there's wet brush 1, wet brush 2. And if I paint with a color with one of these brushes, all right, I can have what looks like sort of a watercolor kind of look to it. Okay, but you know, and I know that when you put a mark down with pixel brushes, that mark is fixed, it's on the canvas. If I try and paint again, everything I paint is going to simply be additive. It's going to add to what's there, but nothing is going to actually move and flow like watercolor. And so if you really want something different, actually I'll leave one of those on there. There we go. You can use the watercolor brushes in Fresco. Okay. And by the way, what I've just shown you here, this is not possible with pixel brushes. There's a texture file associated with it. There are these interesting effects that happen with gradation from one color to another. The color dynamics are different, so that there's a little bit of a change in hue, saturation, and value happening at random intervals and things like that. This is not possible with vector. But if I go to these watercolor brushes in the live brushes category right here, second category down, I could select a watercolor brush and use that same color, right? And let me add some water. Whoop. And now you'll see that the paint will pick up what's there and it'll move accordingly. All right. So the difference between these and regular pixel brushes is that these are considered quote unquote live, in that everything you do is always active and can be activated and can be manipulated, and it's not fixed on the canvas. But again, that's a pixel-based technology. It's not, we're not using any vectors there, apart from, of course, under the hood, the brush stroke itself is a vector path, but it's being rendered in pixels that allow you to have these sort of natural media effects. The other cool thing about this is you can just use water if you want. So I can suck all the color out of this brush by tapping on the color wheel and just tapping on this little transparent circle right here. I can just use a little bit of water, maybe make my brush bigger, and just tap anywhere and allow that to just kind of flow away. And you'll notice I was doing this on the same layer as where I used that Photoshop brush right here. So I can do the same thing with anything I put down on the canvas. So if I want to use a combination of a Photoshop brush and some water, right? I can go back to that watercolor brush. I can suck the color out there and I can sort of blend some bits together like this and soften them. And everything remains editable then. So that's some stuff that's possible with watercolors. And there are also oils as well. We covered that in the other demo and live stream that you and I did a little while back. And yes, of course, if you want to add animation with these brushes, you may. So with this brush, for example, if I wanted to do the same thing I was doing a moment ago, create a little color, do something, and add a little blue to get that nice color blend like that, I can create another layer. I'll get a little ghost of that, and I can make that blue spread a little bit further, add a bit more pink there, make that a little longer, right? And I'm animating now with those watercolor brushes, okay? Now you notice I only had 2 frames of animation there, and this is what I really, really love about what's possible here. As an animator, one of the things that's frustrating if you're working with these layer stacks that are vertical and everything is tied to one timeline is that if you want to work with different timing for separate elements of the animation, this can be confusing and difficult. Here, you can simply decide how you want, or for what duration you want something to animate, for how many frames, for example, over the course of the total number of frames of the animation. You can decide how many you want, knowing that it's going to repeat. And if you do some very basic math, let's say, for example, you have a segment of your illustration that's 20 frames long. If you want some other thing to happen, okay, and you want it to loop 4 times, then you simply make it 5 frames long, and you know that it will loop 4 times over the course of the total animation. So if one thing moves for a total of 20 frames and another one moves for a total of 5, every 5 frames, that other element will loop, and every 20 frames, the first element will loop. And so you can start to build in these not only regular timed sections of your illustration, but also irregularly timed sections. So even though I'm working currently with a document that has a total of 10 frames of animation, this is where my document timeline comes in handy. I can turn this on, and once that's there, right, I can see this little bars here at the top showing me the total number of frames in the animation for this file across all layers. So I now know that there are a total of 10 frames. And as I move it, I can see what's happening across those 10 frames with each layer. So the first 2 layers, okay, go through a total cycle of 1 full animation from the first frame to the 10th. But if you look over here, okay, where I've drawn the watercolor bit, you'll notice that it goes 1, 2, then back to the first, back to the second, back to the first, back to the second. It's going to repeat a total of 5 times. And the cool thing about this is I can do an irregular animation, like I just said. So let's go back to the second frame, and I'll long tap on it, and this gives me options, one of which is to duplicate the frame. So I could duplicate this frame, and it'll simply mean that it's going to hold on that second frame. There's a duplicate of it, so it'll be the duration of 2 frames. Speaking of holding on a frame is probably at the top of the list of things that people are asking us to add as an animation feature. And so that is coming in the June release for Fresco. You'll be able to simply tap on a frame and you can then set a duration for how long you're going to hold. Okay. All right, so let's go back. Now you know that I have 10 frames, but 3 is not going to go into 10. So what happens when I hit play? You'll see it skip where it's an irregular loop. Now, at first, people might say, well, I don't want that. But if you think about it, what's great about this is you can then add irregular animation to an illustration. If you want something to not be so repetitive, then you can intentionally put an odd number of frames into some kind of total number of frames in which it's not divisible, and get some pretty cool results. So again, the independence of each of these layers to do what it wants to do for the entirety of the illustration, the animated illustration, gives you some options you don't have anywhere else. It's pretty cool. And again, my layer stack, if you look over here, is nice and clean. I've got 3 animated layers right here. And that's it. All right, so let's move on from here. So yes, I can animate with any of these. I'll go ahead and delete this, don't need it. And we'll come back here. We don't need our little vector. Actually, I'll leave that there for a minute because there's something I want to show you. But first, I'll hide that. We'll come back to our original. Okay. I have frame by frame animation happening with this current layer. Not only that, but what I've done intentionally is moved it. If I were to just draw a little path for you, I've moved it from here to here, right? That's sort of the path that I've drawn it on. Now, what we do to make things much simpler for you in Fresco is add motion paths to anything. So when I'm thinking as an animator, I'm thinking, okay, this circle is going to be not only moving in this sort of S-curve, but it's going to be growing smaller all the way. What if I didn't have to think about both? What if all I had to do was make the circle get smaller and worry about the S-curve later? Well, you can do that. Whoops. That was my son. He wrote his name there. All right, so let's take a look at that. So I'll come back over here, and I'm going to now delete these frames that I don't need. Okay, we don't need any of these anymore, so I'll just delete these. Because what I want to do instead is draw the circle simply shrinking. That's all I'm going to do. So these will go away. And let's start with our first circle here. Okay. And I'll just draw, go back to my recent brushes. Another nice feature we have is you can use however many brushes you want in a document. Even if you use 100 brushes, Fresco will remember every brush you used in the order in which you used it. So you never have to come back to a file you did 6 months ago wondering what brushes you used to do that cool effect you did. They'll all be remembered. So I'll go back to my default pencil here. And now I'll just make the circle a little smaller. And we'll do this. And we'll just do it now over 5 frames. Okay? There. So now the circle is going to get smaller. I'm going to go ahead and set this to a loop. There we go. Okay, what now? Well, you may have noticed this little option here that says path down in my options for motion. If I tap on path, I'm just going to draw that same S-curve I did before. Okay, and now you see that it's going to move. Oh, I must have added an extra pixel somewhere. Sorry, gang. I can't see it anywhere. It's gone. I can't see it. It's probably 1 pixel big, but I can't see it. So hang on a moment. Bear with me. This will be easy to fix. I'm just going to hide this for a sec. And we'll get rid of all these so things aren't getting too cluttered. And then I'll do this. Boom. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, same animation. Tap on path, and then just draw the curve. And now it's going to move along that path. Okay? So if I want this to happen twice along the path, for example, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my frames right here, and I'm going to set them to a value of 10. And what that's going to tell me is this entire action is going to happen over the course of 10 frames. And you can see that happening right now. The moment I set that value, you can see now it's happening 2 times, 2 cycles of that animation along that path. All right. Maybe I want it to happen 4 times. So I'll set it to 20, right? One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. Amazing. All right, now let's do this. Hit play. Draw another path. Draw a really long path. Look at the difference now with timing. For the longest path, it will still acknowledge that I want the full cycle of the animation to happen 4 times. So it's going to appropriately extend, okay, that animation, slow it down so that it happens across that entire path 4 times in the same way that it happens on the shorter path right here, right? Make another one. So those are about the same length. You want to close a path or get rid of it, all you have to do is delete it. So here we have the long one, here we have the short one. Each of these is going to have the same animated cycle. You can see it, you can count it. And all of this is happening on one layer. So now you can start to realize the possibilities are endless when it comes to combining frame-by-frame animation with motion paths and what a time saver this is for all kinds of things, right? Now, another thing you might notice is that I was busy there drawing, okay, my circle at a certain size and then having it shrink over the course of 5 frames. But I didn't really have to do that either, because I could draw a circle, and with a path, okay, let's draw a path. I can have it move along that path. And look over here, we have grow and shrink right there. I can turn that on, and I can have that percentage be set. Let's go all the way to 200. Big, and then back. So what happens if I go in the opposite direction? Bye-bye. There it goes. Now remember how I said I wanted it to happen 4 times? Right here, number of times. 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom, 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 back and forth. Right? So there are ways to use the motion paths in combination with effects for motion paths to also save time with whatever it is that you're drawing. And the same thing applies here for the speed. We'll go ahead and we'll come down to our frames. We'll set that again to 40, or 20, pardon me. There we go. All right. Draw a longer path here. It's going to slow everything down. Draw a shorter path here. Crazy. All right, we'll close these out, get rid of these.